Before I start the talk, I would like to just begin with a message of assurance to those members who know that by trade, I'm not an historian, but a mathematician. So please don't worry, there aren't going to be any equations in this talk. There's only just, I think, one equal sign, so don't worry about that. On my title slide, I give my acknowledgements to Sheila White, Kat Peterson, and Robin Darwell-Smith, who've been great help to me in providing information about Joseph Ernest Morris. The little guides were published by Methuen in the first part of the 20th century, with really about one volume per county. You'll see from the publisher's advertisements that they were described as not guides in the ordinary sense, but they contain information which may be sufficient for the ordinary tourist of literary tastes. And they form not only practical handbooks, but delightful gift books. Well, we'll see later on to what extent that is true. The little guides have sometimes been described as the Pevsners of their day, and that's a fair description, although there are some important differences. The books in the Buildings of England series, published by Penguin, are rightly called Pevsners because they were largely the creation of one man, Nicholas Pevsner, who wrote the vast majority of the 46 volumes in the series and had a hand in most of the rest. The little guides, in contrast, were written by a large number of different authors, most of whom only contributed one volume to the series. One exception was Joseph Ernest Morris, who, as you will see, actually wrote 5 volumes, 4 volumes for Yorkshire, 1 for each riding and a 4th volume for York. And he also wrote the Northumberland volume, and later on, when Methuen extended their series to the continent, a volume on Holland. I first acquired my copy of the West Riding volume more than 50 years ago. And when I began looking at it, it immediately raised a question mark in my mind, because in the preface, Morris says that his acquaintance with the West Riding dates for almost exactly 30 years ago, which indicates that he wasn't born in Yorkshire. And it turns out that he was about 45 when he wrote this preface. So he didn't visit Yorkshire until he was 15 years old. And he signs the preface from Elstree in Hertfordshire. So he wasn't living in Yorkshire either when he wrote these books. So what then was his connection with Yorkshire? Well, there is a clue in the dedication of the West Riding volume because it's dedicated to the memory of his uncle, Richard Metcalfe of Leyburn in Yorkshire. So for more than 50 years, I thought to myself, I must follow up this clue one day and find out more about Joseph Morris. And I did nothing about it for about 50 years until quite recently, for a reason that I hope to come to before the end of the talk, I followed it up. And what follows is what I found out so far. As I'm giving this talk rather earlier than I originally planned, there are still lots of questions about Joseph Morris that I have not yet answered. Some of them probably it will never be possible to answer. Some probably are not even worth answering. So Joseph Morris, the author, was the son of another Joseph Morris, who was born in Nottinghamshire, and the Yorkshire connection is his mother, Susanna Metcalfe, who was born in Hawes in Yorkshire. And they had 3 sons, Arthur and Christopher, who were born when they were living in Tulse Hill in South London, and the 3rd son, who very inconveniently was given the same name as his father. I hope not to offend anybody present, but I think giving your children the same name as yourself is a source of confusion and is better avoided. But for some reason or other, the 3rd son was called Joseph. So for the time being, I shall refer to him as Joseph Ernest, and he was born in 1865 in Beddington. The father is described as a merchant on the baptismal certificate. In the 1871 census, he appears as a tanner and currier, which means somebody whose trade is the dressing and colouring of leather after it has been tanned. And in 1881, as a leather manufacturer employing 25 persons, one of whom was his middle son. And his elder sons, the other son is also shown on a later census of being entered into his father's business. And indeed, in the 1901 census, they're both shown as living at home and still unmarried. Joseph Ernest was born at the end of 1865 and was baptized at St. Mary's Church, Beddington, early in 1866. The church is a late medieval church. One can't believe that the infant Joseph Ernest was aware that he was being baptized in a medieval church when he was only a few weeks old. But I like to think that it was the fact that his local church was a medieval one, which led to his interest in medieval churches, which we'll see played a large part in his life. When Joseph Ernest was born, Beddington was in Surrey. Today it's in the London borough of Sutton, between Carshalton on the west and Croydon to the east. And the family home was at Clarence Lodge, very close to Wallington Station. And as the map shows, the church where Joseph Ernest was baptized was less than a mile away to the northeast. And I've marked to the left Carshalton House School, because Joseph Ernest took a different direction from his older brothers who went into the father's business. And he went as a day boy to the nearby Carshalton House School. Carshalton House was built in the 17th century for Edward Carlton, a tobacco merchant. In 1863, it became the possession of the Reverend Alfred Barrett, who moved his existing school from North Cheam to Carshalton and renamed the school the Carshalton House School. After Alfred Barrett's death in 1887, the house was bought by the Daughters of the Cross, a Roman Catholic education order, and the sisters opened a school for girls, which flourishes today and continues to exist as St. Philomena's Catholic High School for Girls. It seems to have been quite a reputable school. The principal, Dr. Alfred Barrett, was an alumnus of Worcester College, Oxford, and a Doctor of Divinity. And an advertisement for the school in 1873 says that two of the other teachers were a Reverend E.W. Turner, M.A. Oxford, and a Mr. R.S. Carpenter, M.A. of Cambridge. As this notice says, published in 1872, the school is for the special preparation for the Indian Civil Service, the Royal Artillery, for admission into Sandhurst, etc., and also Oxford and Cambridge examinations. Modern languages, geometrical, I'm pleased to see, mechanical and landscape drawing are taught, and terms for the boarders are 100 guineas per year. So I think it was quite a reputable school, not a public school, but better than just a simple crammers. 100 guineas was quite a large sum of money in 1872, probably just above the average wage for workers at that time. And if at that time you'd wanted to send your son to Eton, that would have cost you about £150 a year. So it was quite an expensive and reputable school. But it does seem to be not a school whose primary purpose was to prepare students for the university. Nonetheless, Joseph Ernest did go to the university, and in 1884, he entered University College, Oxford. The interesting thing, in his application to University College, he described his father as a gentleman. Now, as you will know, it was a matter of some social importance in Victorian England as to whether or not you counted as a gentleman. The word didn't have a precise meaning, but its primary meaning was somebody of independent means, and was also extended to professional men, particularly lawyers, clergymen of the Church of England, and as their social status improved, medical men. But it clearly excluded anyone in trade, unless perhaps you were very rich and could afford to buy yourself a country estate and buy yourself a peerage, which I understand is still the case today. However, it seems to me that in describing his father as a gentleman, Joseph Ernest was stretching things somewhat, and it's perhaps an indication that he wanted to improve his social status and dissociate himself from his father's tanning business. For whatever reason, his academic career wasn't very successful, and he graduated with a third-class honours degree in classics in 1888. He then entered Lincoln's Inn and was called to the bar on January the 27th, 1890. I haven't been able to find out anything about his legal career, but in his books, he does talk about doing the research during the vacation, which does suggest that he was engaged in a legal practice during the legal terms. Somewhat later, he married Annie Robertson from Peterhead in Aberdeenshire, but who was living in West Hampstead at the time. Peterhead is about 20 miles north of Aberdeen and therefore a long way from London. So that raises the conjecture as to what brought her to London and how she met her husband. Well, I can only make a guess. I do know that she had two sisters, one of whom is described as a teacher of physical education, and the other is described as a university tutor, but I don't know which university. So it just suggests that they were a family who pursued education as their careers. And so it's just a conjecture on my part that Joseph Ernest's wife came to London as a teacher, and that's how they came to meet. He might not have been pleased at the fact that the church which they were married was a modern Victorian building, which we'll see later on didn't seem to interest him very much. Those of you who are into family history may recognize the date March 30th, 1901 as the date before the census of that year. And because they appeared in the census the day after, we know that they took their honeymoon at Totnes, staying at the Seven Stars Hotel. Totnes will reappear in just a moment. I can describe the rest of his life very briefly. After marriage, they moved to St Mary's House, Elstree, from which the West Riding volume was written, fairly modest brick house. And round about 1912, they moved to Castle House at Much Haddam. Much Haddam is also in Hertfordshire, but on the eastern edge of the county. And it's where Henry Moore had his studio many years later. I put a question mark after Castle House because in the photograph that I show you of the building, it's from a site where the house is called not Castle House, but the White House. But in his book on Hertfordshire, Pesner describes many of the houses in the high street at Much Haddam in great detail. And this house matches very closely Pesner's description of a white building with 7 bays and a Doric porch. So I'm pretty confident this Castle House later be named as the White House, and what you're seeing is actually a picture of it. Then round about 1937, the family, they moved to Mount Pleasant, again in Totnes. I don't know whether this is just because they enjoyed their honeymoon there or whether they had any other Totnes connections. And Joseph Ernest died in 1954, aged 88. As well as the Little Guides, he was quite a prolific author of books about parts of Britain and elsewhere. So as well as the Little Guide, he wrote a number of books in the Beautiful Britain series and the Homeland Association series. These are quite short books of about 60 pages each. You'll see that he also wrote a short account of Much Haddam Church, where he was living during the war, and also of the parish and priory church of St Mary Totnes, to which he retired. And he did write to his companion into Durham of 1951. It's a fairly substantial book. Interestingly, he became a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries quite late in his life in 1940, when he was already 74. And when he was 80, he presented to the Bodleian Library 36 volumes consisting of notes on the architecture and contents of English churches, and also some French churches and other European churches. I haven't been able to go to Oxford to try and dig these out of the Bodleian Library, so I can't tell you anything about them. It does suggest he had an intense interest in church architecture and visited large numbers of them, and wrote notes about many churches that he never got round to putting in a book. So that's the life of Ernest Morris. Now let me turn to the books. They were quite like Pesner's in the sense that they were quite scholarly volumes, and Joseph Ernest makes use of the published research of his time and gives references to them. And for example, when he discusses Kirkstall Abbey, he makes use of the articles about Kirkstall Abbey in the Thoresby Society's own publications. Also, when he discusses a church like Pesner, he's very keen on describing all the monuments in the church. I say like Pesner, of course he came before Pesner. And it's not surprising, therefore, that Pesner seemed to have regarded Joseph Morris's work in some high regard. So in Pesner's introduction to his book on Yorkshire's West Riding, he says the only attempt at a handy summing up which need to be referred to here is J.E. Morris's Little Guide, written in 1911, but still very useful. The main difference between Morris and Pesner is that Morris's interests were the range of interest was very much limited. Pesner, if you know his volumes, is interested in architecture of all periods, including modern architecture. All his books include at least one photograph of a fairly recent building. Morris, on the other hand's interests seem to be mostly centered on medieval buildings, and he mentions very few secular buildings or churches built later than about 1600. For example, in his introduction to his book on the West Riding, he says, "It is singular, in fact, that it is possible to take up a whole sheet of the 1-inch ordnance map, sheet 86, the bulk of which is occupied with Yorkshire, yet the Yorkshire portion of which contains at the present day only the single medieval church of Penistone." This point is emphasized if we look at what he says about Harewood. He says quite correctly that the objects of interest in Harewood are Harewood House and Park, the parish church with its magnificent collection of monuments, and the remains of the old castle of the Albans. But when you turn over the page, you will find a very full description of All Saints Church in Harewood with a full description of all the monuments in it. A very, very full description of Harewood Castle. Indeed, he gives more space to Harewood Castle than does Pesner. But when it comes to Harewood House, there is no further mention at all, despite, as we all know, the magnificent architecture of Harewood House. Morris doesn't seem to be interested in it at all. In the light of this, you might, those of you who know Huddersfield, might like to think which buildings in Huddersfield do you think Morris singled out for attention? Well, the answer is nothing at all. He says that Huddersfield is one of the best built, but it's absolutely without interest to the archaeologist. And he very rapidly moves on to discuss Ilkley. Now, this is despite the fact, well, it's certainly true that in Huddersfield there are no old churches. The oldest church, I believe, in Huddersfield is Thomas Taylor's Holy Trinity Church of 1816. But Huddersfield boasts a railway station, which Pesner describes as one of the best early railway stations in England. And here is a engraving of the railway station shortly after it's opened. I wonder whether Morris ever actually went to Huddersfield. But if you are never had seen Huddersfield railway station from the outside, and you happen to be traveling from Leeds to Manchester by train when you're not in a hurry, it's well worth getting off the train at Huddersfield, spending a few minutes to look at the railway station, and then getting back on the next train to Manchester. The interesting thing is, what does Morris mean when he talks about it being absolutely without interest to the archaeologist? What's his concept of archaeology? The Oxford English Dictionary gives two meanings to archaeology: ancient history generally, and the scientific study of the remains and monuments of the prehistoric period. More recently, archaeology, I think, is used in a wider sense. For example, we talk about industrial archaeology, covering the artifacts of the Industrial Revolution, therefore not more than about 300 years old. Morris seems to be described meaning by archaeology in some sort of medieval sense, which covers medieval buildings, but nothing more recent than that. Against this background, you may be wondering what Morris made of our own city of Leeds. Well, we get an early warning when he discusses the River Aire, because in his gazetteer, Morris includes not only settlements, but also geographical features. So I should just say, before I come on to that, that the advertisement for Little Guide say that they cover everything that is interesting in the nature of the features, history and archaeology and architecture of the town and district treated. That seems to me not to be true. And if you bought the West Riding book in 1911 and the Trades Description Act had been in force, I think you would have had good grounds for asking for your money back. Now to the River Aire, he gives us a very nice photograph of Malham Cove, and he does seem to like photographs with water in them. And this is what he says of the River Aire. The Aire, rising in magnificence at the foot of Malham Cove, preserves a rural character on its immediate banks as low as Keighley or lower, but no river in Yorkshire, unless it be the Don, is doomed to deeper, ultimate degradation than this unhappy stream, which stained to unnatural colour and polluted with every form of filth, even before it approaches Leeds, flows finally through that murky city in a course that reminds one of a circle in Dante's hell. That seems to me to be very strong language for condemning the River Aire, but knowing what we know about Morris, I can't but remember that his father was a tanner and courier, and those of you who remember the Leeds tanning industry, particularly along Meanwood Beck, will know that it's an industry that uses lots of noxious chemicals and is a great polluter. And I can't help feeling this condemnation of the River Aire is part of Morris's desire to dissociate himself from his father's industry. In the light of what he says about the River Aire, it should come as no surprise that Morris is one of a long line of visitors who found Leeds to be a dirty and unpleasant city. However, I'm pleased to say he didn't give us quite the same brush off that he gave to Huddersfield. Leeds, he says in rather condescendingly, must be accepted as a place of some importance, having reference to its size and population. 500,000 people cannot likely be dismissed as though non-existent. Thank you, Mr. Morris, for that. Otherwise, the city possesses less attraction than hundreds of country villages that boast an ancient church. Leeds, moreover, exhibits neither dignity nor beauty. It is questionable whether any other city, except perhaps Sheffield, displays to the railway traveller such a scene of smoky hideousness as is displayed to those who, descending from the Bramhope Tunnel, having left only a few minutes behind them the green and open valley of the Wharf, looks out towards the east along the filthy River Aire. However, despite this, we should perhaps be grateful for the fact that Morris does concede that Leeds possesses one or two objects of archaeological interest to those who have the patience to seek them amongst so much noise and dirt. He's not happy with the fact that the old medieval parish church was pulled down, and is rather snooty about the current building, which he describes as sham perpendicular, and says it's darkened by a stupendous display of bad modern glass. Those of you who know the parish church, now the minster, better than I do, might like to say whether or not you think he's being fair to the church in that description. Not surprisingly, he is enthusiastic about the pre-Norman cross, which, as you know, was discovered, or parts of it were discovered when the old church was demolished, and the cross was then reconstructed in the new church. And he then goes on to describe the church in some detail. And you probably won't find it hard to guess that the only other central Leeds building that Morris mentions is St. John's Church, and he's really quite enthusiastic about that. but there's no mention of Holy Trinity, nor of the town hall, or of the arcades in what we now call the Victoria Quarter, which I think gives Leeds some dignity and beauty that Morris claims not to be able to find. Of course, Leeds wasn't at its best in the period between 1905 and 1910, was Morris was writing his book, but nor was it at its worst. Leeds, as we know, was a smoky city until well after the Second World War. Even today, the contrast between suburban Leeds to the south of the Bramhope Tunnel and Wharfdale to the north is a striking one. Emerging from the tunnel when travelling towards Harrogate always lifts my spirits, so it's not surprising perhaps that approaching Leeds in the opposite direction had the opposite effect on Joseph Morris. I should say, to be fair to him, that in the geographical place in his book, he does give a full description of Kirkstall Abbey, making use of Thoresby Society publications. And I don't know whether he chose the photographs, but he has this rather charming photograph of Kirkstall Abbey. I can't remember seeing any other image of Kirkstall Abbey with so much water in it, but it's more of a scenic view of Kirkstall Abbey than a photograph which shows you a great deal about the architecture of the building. He also discusses Temple Newsam in some detail, and he also mentions discusses and describes the ancient churches at Adel and at Whitkirk. Morris much prefers Bradford, which he describes as one of the best built in the country. But when he describes the new Midland Railway Station, itself almost worthy of Belgium, I wonder why he failed to mention the much finer railway station in Huddersfield. And he describes the Town Hall of Bradford as a fine building. Again, I wonder why he mentioned the Town Hall in Bradford, but not our own Town Hall in Leeds, which I think is a better building. Well, I think he was biased in favour of Bradford because Bradford has, to quote, what Leeds no longer boasts, a medieval church of size and interest. And he goes on to describe this church in some detail. And as I show, I think he liked towns with medieval churches and not towns that didn't have them. So when it comes to Halifax, he says it's by far the most, of all the greater business towns of the riding, it is by far the most pleasantly placed. But the only building in Halifax which really enthuses him, the single glory of Halifax, he said, is its grand old mother church. And there's no mention of Halifax Town Hall, which is quite an interesting building, and no mention at all of the Peace Hall. I would guess he wouldn't like the Peace Hall because it was associated, of course, with trade. You'd expect Morris to quite like Wakefield with its medieval church and its chantry chapel on the bridge. And indeed, he does say of Wakefield that it possesses such the handsome new county offices, and the town hall is also striking. And these two recent buildings give to modern Harrogate a dignity. Again, why mention the town hall in Wakefield if you're not going to mention the town hall in Leeds? But of course, he does have some negative things to say about Wakefield, because he talks about the dingy red brick streets of this northern capital. He does mention the parish church, but he's not all that enthusiastic about it. It was a cathedral when he wrote about it in 1910, and he says it must be permitted to regret that it was elected for this honour with or without sufficient reason in preference to Selby Abbey. Well, here perhaps Morris was unfortunate in not having available to him the article written by our late president, Peter Morris, and published in our proceedings in 1994 about Leeds and the dismemberment of the Diocese of Frickley, in which Peter describes how the church decided where the cathedrals of the new diocese would be. And in his article, Peter explains why Bradford was chosen and Selby wasn't even considered. We've seen that when Morris was writing about Leeds, he did suggest that Sheffield might be even worse. So with due apologies to anyone who's fond of Sheffield, let's have a look and see what he says about Sheffield. So he describes Sheffield as a place of singular and attractiveness Most of its streets are squalid and grimy, and the town as a rule is buried under a pall of gloomy smoke that perhaps is only too emblematic of the lives of those who toil inside it. And then there is a quotation for those with literary tastes. "'Tis the last judgment fires must cure this place, calcine its sods and let its prisoners free." So Morris seems to be saying that the only solution for Sheffield is to burn it all down. At least he spared that thought for the city of Leeds. I don't know how many people in my audience this evening have literary tastes. I admit I had to go to the reference books to locate the source of this quotation. Some of you may recognize the author, but this is not a quiz program, so I'll pass on very rapidly. I don't have time to go through the whole of Morris's gazetteer, but his books on Yorkshire are, of course, in the Thoresby Society Library. And if I'm interested in them, do come into the library and have a look through them. But I will mention one more church which he mentions because there's a slight mystery associated with that. And this is the church at Frickley, near Doncaster. He says it has a small church of little interest, but having said it's of little interest, he goes on to give quite a long description of it and gives more space to Frickley Church than to the entire city of Huddersfield. And you'll notice that his reference is to TSP 1905 for his information. Now, TSP is his abbreviation for Thoresby Society Excursion Publication. And indeed, it is true that in 1905, we had an excursion to Frickley Church. And as was the custom at the time, each excursion was accompanied with a 4-page printed leaflet. Probably this is too small for you to be able to read, but on the left-hand side is the front of the leaflet, which gives details of the excursion. That's really a subject for another day, but you'll see that excursion didn't start till 1:15 on the Saturday morning, because people in those days worked on Saturday mornings, and you left Leeds by the GNR station, travelled by train to South Emsall, and then arrived at Frickley Hall by driving. And I guess in 1905, driving meant in a horse-drawn charabanc and not a motor vehicle. And eventually you arrived back in Leeds at 8:48. Inside the leaflet, on the right-hand side, there is a full description of the church at Frickley, and it's from this that Morris gained his information. The photograph isn't in the leaflet, but I've included it because it seems to me that the church is about the same date as the church at Bedlington and fairly similar to it. And I wonder whether Morris noticed that fact. But the puzzle is, how did Morris come to see this leaflet? Our publications were and still are available in many libraries. And as we say in our annual report, we've recently digitized all our Series 1 publications, so they're available for anyone to read from anywhere in the world. But where might he have seen information, these leaflets? As far as I know, they've not been deposited in any library. You won't find them anywhere on our website, but there is a box amongst our records which contains most of these leaflets. But how did Morris come to see them? Well, either he had a friend who was a member of the Thoresby Society, but I've not been able to trace any connection of that kind, or maybe he visited the Thoresby Society to see its library and was shown these leaflets. So far, I think I've given you the impression that Joseph Morris was a man of rather conservative tastes, and despite, or perhaps because of his father's occupation as a tanner, he disliked industry intensely, and whenever he saw industry, he resorted to the strong rhetoric, which I've already shown you. However, in one respect, Joseph Morris was ahead of his time. As you will know, in recent times, there's been a lot of debate about how we should view the British Empire, with the debate ranging from those on the one hand who wish to remove all public statues that pay homage to anyone with any connection to the slave trade, to those on the other hand who sometimes seem to think it's unpatriotic to mention any of the darker aspects of British history. So I was surprised and impressed when I came to look at Morris's volume on York, because he denounces the massacre of the Jews in York in 1190 in very strong language. He described it as one of the ghastliest episodes of fanatical brutality that disfigure English history, and he went on to describe that sad event in some detail. I was brought up in the Jewish community in Leeds, so I've known the story of this massacre ever since I was a young lad, but in the years since, I've often found that many people seem to be hardly aware of it. And as far as I know, the existence of this incident was not publicly acknowledged in York until 1990, when a plaque was erected at the foot of the present Clifford's Tower on the 800th anniversary of this sad event. Anyway, I think more highly of Morris and think that although he may have been conservative in his architectural tastes, he may have been more liberal in other respects. I'd like to end the talk by mentioning an aspect of the little guides which I particularly like, which is not due to Morris, but due to his publisher. And these are the excellent maps. Each volume in the Little Guide series contains a fold-out map produced by the well-known Edinburgh map makers Bartholomew's. The map of West Yorkshire is too large for me to be able to show you all of it. So all you can see on the screen is the top right-hand corner of the map. And you probably can't read it because it's got a lot of detail in it, and the rivers and the roads and the railways are all clearly marked. And in this respect, he's well ahead of Pevsner's Buildings of England series. But in addition to these fold-out maps, on the inside front cover of each of these volumes is a map of the railways of the relevant areas. So the West Riding volume contains this map. 1911, when the book was published, was when the railway system was more or less at its height, and you could get to almost anywhere in the West Riding by rail. There's been a lot of talk recently about how our area needs a mass transit system. Well, I agree with that, but I'm always puzzled when people say that, because I want to say, well, we do have a mass transit system, the railway system, and it's a great shame that many of the lines that you can see on the screen have since closed and been built on, making it impossible to open the railway lines. But this is not the opportunity for me to be making a political speech about transport policy. So I will end there on that nostalgic note, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Well, it's usual at this stage of the proceedings for the speaker to say that they are keen to answer questions. I think all I can say is if anyone's got any questions they want to ask, I'm very happy to listen to them. I'm not sure that I could answer any of them. So if anyone would like to say anything or ask any questions, this is please unmute yourself and do that.
Hi, Alan. It's John Steele. There seemed to be a lot of architectural snobbery around what is the Little Guide.
Yes.
Does that snobbery manifest itself in any other part of his life, as far as your research is?
I don't know. I think he was brought up. His father was a manufacturer in trade. He does seem to have moved in very much the opposite direction by going to, we don't know enough about his life to understand why he went to university and his elder brothers didn't. But he then became a lawyer, and later in his life became a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. He described his father as a gentleman when he applied to University College. So I think he just was uncomfortable in the social position of his father, aimed to raise his social status. But that's all I know about him. And so I would not so say snobbery, unless you think it's snobbish to pretend to a higher social position than you perhaps merit.
It's a self-defeating argument, that.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Alan, if I Kevin Grady speaking, your comments on his comments on architecture, it rather reminded me of when I was at secondary school, and we had a young art master who ran the local history society, of which I was a member. And I once said to him that I really liked the Victorian buildings in Birmingham, because I liked their architectural style. And he turned to me, he said, "That's not architecture, that's just brick buildings with some stone cladding on them." And I was very taken aback, because by that point I had got rather enthusiastic about Victorian architecture. And I think perhaps your Ernest really, he thought Victorian architecture was a very modern and it wasn't real architecture. But I also noticed, in the things that he liked and disliked, basically he didn't like Leeds Town Hall because it was classical architecture. He did like Bradford Town Hall because it's sort of Venetian style rather than being classical. And I think, that's probably why I didn't mention Huddersfield railway station, because again, classical buildings. So it seemed perfectly clear that he only really liked things that were medieval.
Yes. Yes, I think that's a very fair comment, Kevin. And as we all know, Victorian architecture was really out of fashion. I don't know, you know more about this than I do, when it became back into fashion.
Well, we're really talking sort of 1970s onwards, when Victorian architecture, all this campaign European year of architectural heritage, when basically buildings started being cleaned and people could appreciate the architectural detail of them.
Anyone else want to make a comment?
Yes, John.
This is John Todd speaking. I was amused by your opening comment about the problems of naming your children after their parents. Indeed, we have found innumerable issues arising by calling our eldest son John. Yes. The reason for this is that he's about the fifth or sixth John Todd in the successive generations. Right. But now that he's reached 50 odd, we're having all sorts of problems, especially even at the doctors. They find it very difficult to decide whether it's me or my son who's consulting them.
Right, so that's a warning to anybody, and it's certainly a nightmare for anyone trying to track people down. So I can understand there is a tradition. I think perhaps with the Churchill tradition of using Winston and Randolph in alternative generations might be better than using the same first name in every generation. So maybe you might suggest that to your son or your grandchildren if it's too late for your son.
He has a John Todd as well, but he's called Daniel as a first name.
Okay, good. Thank you for that comment. Does anybody else wish to contribute?
Could I just ask, why did he dedicate it to his uncle?
Well, I don't know the reason for that. He wrote the East Riding and North Riding volumes first, and one of those was, I can't remember which way around, one was dedicated to his mother and the other to his father. So probably having done that, he looked around for another relative. And it seems that this was in memory of, so his uncle was dead at the time. So I think maybe that was the reason, but that's only a guess.
If I can add, Alan.
Yes.
Really to say that I thought that his comments on the state of the various towns and how dirty and filthy and nasty they were well merited. I'm sure he's absolutely right. I mean, even in the 1960s and 70s, coming to university, when I used to ride up towards Sheffield on my motorbike, there was just this black cloud hanging over the place. And of course, I mean, the state of the rivers, I mean, irrespective of whether his father was a tanner or not, I mean, the rivers at those days and, well into the 20th century were terribly polluted, whether it was Wakefield, Castleford, Leeds. So I think he just provides a very accurate description of the state of the places.
And don't you still find the strength of his language a bit surprising?
Oh, I think as a historian, it's very quotable, isn't it? So
yes,
we love it, Alan. That's the sort of stuff we want.
Can you hear me, Alan?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, because in fact, what he reminded me of was Pugin's book. I think it's called Contrasts, where he takes there are drawings of, in fact, the medieval town halls, the churches, the hospitals, and so on. And then on the opposite page, there is the modern, and it's quite clear where, in fact, Pugin's sort of loyalties lie. And I think why people reacted in the way that you've described is not just because of the intrinsic quality of the buildings, but because of what they represented. So that, in a way, it's a bit like William Morris, isn't it? And, you know, the Preservation Society that he founded. They believed, I think quite wrongly, but they did believe that these were just better sorts of society in the Middle Ages, that it was, you know, a time when people cared for each other, when there was collective identities, that people behaved more morally, and so on and so forth. So there's a long tradition of favouring the medieval as against the modern, however you define the modern. And it's not just true of Britain, actually. You find it in France too.
Yes, but as we know, people romanticise medieval Britain. And as we also know, when agricultural workers had the choice, they all flocked to the towns and cities, despite the awful conditions in which they had to live and work. Because also, as we know, Pugin favoured Gothic architecture for what I might describe as theological reasons as much as anything else, because he viewed the towers and pinnacles as reaching out to God. And he certainly didn't like classical architecture in churches. Any other comments?
There was a real reaction against classical architecture as being pagan architecture.
Yes, indeed. Any other comments?
Can I just ask, Alan,
Yes.
do we know how widely these books were published and who was buying them?
I don't know how, they were certainly widely published because the West Riding volume went into 3 editions and most of the other volumes were printed and reprinted, not very frequently. I'll just look at check one out. But for example, my copy of the East Riding was first published in 1906 and second edition 1920. So they probably weren't bestsellers. They were sold at about 3 shillings and 6pence, which again, that was quite a lot of money. Only middle-class people in those days could afford it to buy books. So I think they must have been fairly popular, but probably more, I would have guessed as many people bought them as bought Pesners, which, as you know now, are extremely expensive.
Interesting, thank you.
But I don't know the answer to that. But they went on publishing them, and they extended them to Europe. So clearly the publishers made a bit of money out of it. I very much doubt whether it contributed very much to Morris's income.